Ready or not, here I come. Today we're going to talk about something that sounds incredibly boring until you realize it may be one of the most important developments in NG911 right now. Readiness Declarations. I know, try to contain your excitement, but listen, before you click away thinking it's another thrilling discussion about regulatory filings, stick with me for just a few minutes because this story is actually about something much bigger. It's about what happens when states start saying that they're ready for NG911 and the people that need to connect to them, the carriers, start responding with something that sounds suspiciously like, well, maybe not. And that's where things start to get interesting, right here on TiPS, Today in Public Safety.
Welcome to TiPS, Today in Public Safety, your go-to podcast for today's breaking stories and public safety news. Here's your host, Fletch, with today's tips.
Welcome to TiPS, Today in Public Safety. This is Fletch. I'm a NENA certified ENP, and every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday each week, I bring you the latest in public safety news and information. Let's get started. Readiness Declarations. Now, I understand many of you likely have never heard what a readiness declaration actually is. So let's start off with a simple explanation. You see, for a couple of decades now, public safety has been talking about next generation 911. We've talked about the EZNets, the Emergency Services IP networks, that are like the underlying internet of 911 services. We've talked about NGCS, or Next Generation Core Services. That's the state's or 911 authorities' network that delivers the service. We've talked about SIP signaling, which is that modern IP-based magic protocol that allows voice, video, text, and multimedia to pass between two parties. If you've ever video conferenced, you've used it. And we've talked about all the additional data, the geospatial routing, and all those other shiny objects that show up in PowerPoint presentations that gets people like me really excited. But eventually, somebody's got to stop talking about NG911 and actually deploy it. And that's exactly where the FCC's regulatory readiness process comes into play. A state, a commonwealth, or other 911 authority has got the ability to effectively raise its hand and announce, "We're ready. Our infrastructure is in place. The door's open. Bring us your NG911 traffic." And once that event happens, special federally mandated obligations begin to apply to the originating service providers, the carriers, the people that deliver your local services. So in other words, the conversation changes from someday to it's showtime. Phase 1 in plain English. Now, Next Generation 911 Phase 1 readiness is relatively straightforward. You can think of it as changing the destination address for the carriers for them to deliver their 911 calls to the 911 authority. Historically, carriers would deliver the 911 traffic to legacy infrastructure known as E911 selective routers, and they use legacy voice-only trunks. Phase 1 says, okay, now deliver those calls to the NG911 point of interconnection, and do that using SIP. Now, for some, that's a significant change. What the state's essentially saying is, look, we built a brand new off-ramp. Stop using the old one. Now, that doesn't mean that every NG911 feature is active. Doesn't mean that flying unicorns and geospatial routing are suddenly going to appear overnight. No, what it does mean is that NG911 infrastructure is ready to receive traffic through the new designated connection points. And basically, that leaves the carrier with a little bit of work to do. Phase 2, where things get real. Now, once Phase 2 readiness is declared, by the way, which can happen at the same time as Phase 1, this is where the conversation becomes much more interesting and more often than not, quarrelsome. Because now we're talking about true NG911 compatible delivery. It's no longer just transporting a call. It now includes transporting all of that additional information that can be supplied with the call. Location information, routing information, standards-based signaling, video, multimedia, pictures, and text. And these are all the pieces that allow the NG911 ecosystem to function exactly the way it was designed to function. And this is right where Massachusetts becomes particularly important, as well as the state of Illinois, because these two states have declared their Phase 2 readiness. And that says they're not just ready to receive SIP traffic, they're ready to operate the NG911 environment. And that becomes a very different statement, and that's what's creating a very different set of expectations. So why all the drama? Well, whenever a state declares either readiness, someone's got to change the way they've been operating and inevitably starts arguing about whether the state's actually ready, or whether the filing is complete, or whether testing should occur first, or whether additional clarification is needed in the matter, or whether Mercury is in retrograde. Look, some of those concerns may be legitimate. There's no doubt that building an NG911 infrastructure is complicated. Certainly testing matters, governance matters, operational readiness matters. Nobody wants to flip the switch and then discover that a problem happens during a real emergency. And no one's asking anyone to do that. But let's also be honest. Yeah, this is all brand new technology to public safety, but it's also technology that's been used in our businesses, banking, airlines, hospitals, and commercial services for more than 2 decades. But I think there's also another factor that's in play: the fear of change. Because NG911 forces change throughout the ecosystem. Changes to interfaces, changes to operational procedures, changes to accountability, and changes to business models that have existed forever. And history has repeatedly demonstrated that the carriers are often very enthusiastic about innovation right up until the time where it comes to put that innovation in play and do something. The part that nobody is talking about. Look, here's what I find fascinating about all this. In these conversations, everyone's always focused on carriers and state 911 authorities. But I think the bigger story is what comes next. Because carriers aren't the only organizations preparing for NG911. Universities are preparing, hospitals are preparing, corporate campuses are preparing, and transit agencies are preparing. So are large enterprises and school systems. You see, most of these organizations understand that they already possess immeasurably more information about an emergency than a traditional voice call could ever hope to deliver. Critical information like indoor maps, access control information, video analytics, and even real-time occupancy information of a particular area. Then there are the panic alerts, the IoT sensor data, as well as all that building intelligence that can greatly assist in creating dynamic responder instructions. The list keeps growing and growing, and increasingly these organizations are asking a very reasonable question. Hey, if that NG911 ecosystem is ready and it can receive this information, how do we get our data in there so we can improve urgent response in our facility? And that's where things become very uncomfortable, because somebody's got to transport the data, somebody's got to secure it, somebody has to validate it, and somebody has to decide what passes through and what doesn't. And then suddenly NG911 isn't just a public safety project anymore. It's a carrier project, it's an enterprise project, it's a network architecture project, and it's a business model project. The big picture. Look, I believe that we're entering the beginning of one of the most disruptive periods in 911 functionality that we have ever witnessed. Not because of technology. No, the technology largely exists. The disruption, I think it's going to come from accountability. You see, for years, everyone could point at someone else. The state wasn't ready. The carriers weren't ready. The vendors weren't ready. Or the standards weren't finished. And to be honest, much of that was true. Plus, to top it all off, the funding wasn't available either. So in reality, yeah, we needed it, but the stars were never aligned. But now, states are filing their readiness declarations. And beyond those Phase 2 that are ready, there's a whole slew of Phase 1s. And every one of the new declarations removes yet another excuse from the list. So the conversation, well, it's changing from when NG911 arrives to NG911 is here, what's your plan? And that is a very different conversation. And I think it's one that carriers, vendors, enterprises, and public safety agencies are all going to have to answer. The bottom line. Look, Massachusetts may ultimately be remembered as much more than just another readiness filing. It may become one of the first major examples of what happens when a state says, we're ready, and the rest of the ecosystem needs to decide whether it's ready too. Because readiness declarations are no longer theoretical. No, they're federal regulations, and they start the FCC shot clock for action. So today, these obligations are real and federally regulated. So whether you're a carrier, an enterprise, a vendor, or a public safety agency, the next generation 911 future is rapidly becoming a present-day operational requirement. Ready or not, here it comes. Thanks for sticking with me on this one. Remember to like and subscribe. This is Fletch, and that's today's episode of TiPS, Today in Public Safety.
You've been listening to TiPS, Today in Public Safety, your go-to podcast for today's breaking stories and public safety news. Hosted by Fletch and available every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Catch past episodes on 911tips.com. Be sure to like and subscribe, and remember to join us each week for the latest on NG911. I am Spider Harrison, the official 911 voiceover dude. Catch me on Sirius XM on various channels, including 90s on 9, the 10 spot, and on the weekend countdown on Hits 1. Or don't regret it for the rest of your life. Either way, I'm good.